The overarching aim of the journal is to make genuine ways of knowing and specific methodologies in the discipline of architecture explicit and accessible, and to contribute to the body of knowledge in architecture. And it is the idea to create a context in which the needs of architects, both from the field of practice, of research, of theory, are addressed and are met in their adequate formats and a platform in which architectural ways of knowing can be mediated and conveyed. And on the other hand, it is the aim to bring together a community of architects who investigate within their own discipline and to create a network internationally in which exchange and visibility and access to knowledge are created.
In this regard, I would like to add that our aim with the journal also is to close a gap that we have identified, a gap of a scientific journal for and with architects, where the whole process of the reviewing, of the keeping the scientific standards and so on is really tailor-made for the architectural way of thinking and knowing. This is something that is very often missing, and architects do not familiar with this, and architectural researchers, and here we think we can make a substantial contribution to the landscape of scientific publishing.
Mm-hmm. And the overarching intention of the journal dimension is also to address architecture-specific ways of knowledge creation. The architectural design is at the core of our of all the investigations with specific interest and the identification of the plurality in it, as opposed to the general design term in other disciplines. Our aim is to bring the core discipline of architecture, the architectural design, with all its manifold aspects into the focus of observation and analysis, and to provide space for its presentation.
So when we look at the discipline of architecture at the moment, we can see that there are different forces that are kind of shifting away. We have the practice of architecture, we have research around different topics of architecture, mainly conducted by non-architects and non-designers that are focusing more on side aspects, but that are not essential for our way of thinking and acting. And we have a kind of architectural theory that also sometimes decouples from the architectural making and thinking. And we really try to have the implications with this journal to bring this together again, to reflect on the practice by practitioners, to do research that addresses really the core questions that we want to solve, and by this adding also to the theoretical body of knowledge, not something that is just standing for its own, but really is enriching our doing, making, and thinking in the overall field of architecture.
Mm-hmm. And the entanglement in theories is in the haze of architecture is a phenomenon of our time. They often seem more an end in themselves. It's a bit critic, but I think so, and are often far removed from the core of our discipline. The thinking and the making of space, be it landscape, urban planning, or architecture. Thinking and making are going hand in hand in architectural design, and the highest goal is to do something well for its own sake. Architectural designing itself is a cultural technique, the fundamentals of which, as well as the knowledge of them, must be studied. It is perhaps not so much the opposing concepts of theory and practice that need to be brought together as the two essential aspects of creative processes, namely the intuition and the mind, which intertwine and mutually complement each other inseparably.
And maybe to add here, it is also our intention to address the different ways of knowing and making architecture differently. So the idea is to have a format that allows for the openness of different contributions, be them from the background of architectural design, be it documentary and reflections on a creational and productive process in architecture, or be they superordinate reflections, all intertwined and interlinked. So in order to find a context in which the different ways how we work in architecture are met in their needs and their requirements, we are aiming also to find a different format and to allow for that plurality. And maybe here to add, the digital way of publication also is one way to open that field even further, because it allows to include different formats of documentation, non-textual ways of media, in order to find a spectrum in ways of how we show, discuss, and investigate architecture and the knowledge creation in the discipline.
In this regard, also a little contribution from my side here. It is so that these different fields of architectural making and practice, research in the field of architecture and theory also have traditionally very different publication formats. Books, for example, for the architecture in practice, and then the classical research already are aware and use open access publications. But many things also happen in architecture journals, and by establishing an open access journal that is at the same time printed as a kind of a book, we also want to join these different forces by joining the different media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big question we are working on, but I'd say landscape architecture, urban design, and also architecture are fundamentally disciplines composed of different subjects with a high power of integration, and have those always been interdisciplinary sciences. Therein lies the specific nature of architectural knowledge, I'd say. What's today's professional cultures, which are the product of multiply fragmented knowledge landscape, must first relearn with great effort, is a matter of course of our discipline. It is the handling of disparate methods and terminologies, the mutual exchange and intertwining between theory and practice, the combination of a scientific analysis based on a level of understanding with a speculative concept of intended by intuition, as well as the mind as the core of architectural work. And therefore, it's not surprising that the research foci and methods correspond to the range of fields of work and the different focal points of our discipline. Thinking and making, as well as intuition and mind, are the essential aspects of the creative work on architecture that gives rise to the architectural knowledge.
And I think also here it's very important to highlight how there already is a huge body of knowledge in the discipline of architecture, and how research, of course, is always directed to the future and directed to innovation and invention, which is certainly one focal direction we are taking as well. But there also is a profound knowledge already present in the discipline of architecture throughout all its different facets. And what we are aiming to do as well is to make that explicit and to make that something the architects rely upon in their research. If we look at methodologies in investigation and research in architecture, it becomes very apparent that most likely these methodologies are borrowed from other disciplines, and that the inherent and genuine methodologies in architecture are not so much taken into account as profound ways of the constitution and creation of knowledge, because maybe we as architects are not so much aware that besides the creational and the really factic and manifest results of our work, we also do proceed quite a tremendous amount of knowledge already. And that is one aim, to bring that to awareness, to attention, but also to give the space for that to develop further and to become an explicit and a named and accentuated part of the discipline as well.
Mm-hmm. And there can be added maybe one point, because with a focus on the core discipline of architecture, there are maybe 3 areas which can be distinguished: research through design as a practice-based research approach, for example, or research on architectural design with a focus on the analysis of the design process itself, and the design as research methodology, which entails the elaboration of working methods of research through the design. And in each case, this involves a differentiated approach and a genesis of knowledge in the context of architectural design in different ways.
I'd like to reflect and add to what just Uta said. Is very important that by focusing of these core and essential aspects of architecture, partly means that knowledge is generated from designing, but it does not mean that we are excluding other perspectives, not at all. So it's very important to make sure that this would be a misunderstanding. So an engineering perspective, or a perspective from the humanities, or from architectural history is very much welcome to the journal. The essential question is this knowledge elaborated in a way that it can become productive for architectural way of thinking and designing? And this is also, let's say, the line of selection also for our different curated editions, but also of the open platform for all contributions.
Exactly, yeah.